The race is on, and it's Australian Grand Prix week, so it's time for our season preview. Can Lando Norris make good on title favourite status? Will Max Verstappen make it 5 in a row? Could Ferrari finally break its title drought? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to tackle the big talking points of F1 2025 are Scott Mitchell-Malm and John Noble. Well, Scott, we'll come to you first. Here we go again.
Yes, just like that. Winter's over, launches are over, testing's over. You go through this kind of like iterative process of teams having less and less to hide, and now we go to Australia and we start to get actual, real, concrete answers. Although there'll inevitably be, I'll put money on this now, drivers or teams saying that Melbourne's a bit of an outlier. Let's wait until we get to some more normal tracks, and people will try and kick the can a little bit down the road, whether they're trying to hide the fact that they've started really well and they're trying not to get carried away, or it's a terrible start and they're trying to claim that it's not as bad as it looks.
Exactly, and there'll still be some people trying to do that by the time we get to, I don't know, Las Vegas at the end of the season or something. But John, it's amazing, isn't it, how quickly all this goes? It's going to seem like about 5 minutes and we'll be in Abu Dhabi.
Well, the really weird thing is, if you think about it, we've got 5 races in 6 weeks at the start of the season, which is that a quarter of the season done before we've
just over a fifth now, isn't it, with 24?
Yeah, which is really bizarre to think that before we've even drawn a breath, before teams have been able to think of upgrades or get some serious time back at the factory to either improve their car because they're in trouble or improve their car because they're in front, we're well into the season. So I think it's going to be an absolute kind of intense roller coaster of chaos and madness. And teams are going to scrabble to catch up with what's going on, and we're going to get a really fascinating narrative over this run of 5 weeks.
Yeah, and the really exciting thing is there's the tantalising possibility that this could be a genuinely classic season with 3 or 4 teams up there swinging back and forth on performance from race to race. Potentially not just a drivers' championship battle between 2 drivers, could even be more. Obviously, before the season, that's when the highest hopes are and you have the perfect season in your mind. But this is one that could deliver. So really looking forward to looking at the big picture and discussing the big topics of the season. So let's get into it, John, because Lando Norris, he's the World Championship favourite, had that strong run last year. Pre-season testing's gone well. So can he and McLaren deliver on it? Are they up to it?
I think it's on the table, basically. We always come out of the tests and there's always one standout long run from somebody that people view as this is the killer moment from the test. This is the defining point where someone has shown their cards and we can see the potential. And from Bahrain, it was Lando Norris on the Thursday, that incredible long run, calculated around 30 seconds ahead of what Ferrari and Mercedes were able to do behind him. So I think it's there. The car looks superb on long runs. Lando's full of confidence. The team's assured of itself. I mean, the only question which we talked about the test is there some handling quirk, a rear end nervousness that's going to get exposed at certain tracks? Are characteristics going to catch it out? Was Bahrain helped by the cooler weather not exposing some weaknesses? So I think it's there. The potential's there. I think the question is the reality of a warmer weekend or a different track surface or track characteristics going to maybe make things more equal?
The key question for me, and I don't know what you think about this, Scott, is we think McLaren's going to be strong, but Lando Norris is the really interesting one. He's seemed really, really in control so far this season. Now, that's very easy to see, isn't it? Because nothing's really happened yet. But I talked a lot last season about whether the experience he'll have last year breaking through as a Grand Prix winner, a multiple Grand Prix winner, kind of flirting with having a run at the title, but never really getting involved in it, whether he learns from that and then kind of coalesces into a better version of himself. I think he might well have done that. What do you reckon?
Yeah, you're right. He and McLaren both kind of had a bit of a relaxed feel about them through the test, not in the sense of being complacent or arrogant, but just the confidence that kind of seeps through when you know that the trajectory was in your favour the previous season, and you have that kind of confidence as well from a good winter in terms of your own numbers and progress. Plus, specifically from Norris's perspective, knowing that the playing field is level with Max Verstappen and everybody else, at the start of the year, whereas last year there was a lot of catching up. Basically, the ground lost in the first few races gave Max such a big buffer and meant that Norris and McLaren had a lot of work to do to close the points gap. And Norris, by his own admission, didn't really do a good enough job all of the time in meeting that challenge. But he knows that at his best, he can race Verstappen and beat Verstappen. And he knows at McLaren's best, they can have the fastest car. So they're all starting from zero now. And it just feels like all of those different things have come together to put him in a better place mentally. I'm still, unless you run a simulation on the exact events of last year again, you won't know for sure. I'm still a little bit doubtful that the way that Norris wants to go about racing means that he would be able to overhaul a points deficit to Verstappen, because you think Verstappen's more willing to get his elbows out in that way and be a bit more ruthless. But starting from zero, when there are 24 races ahead, 24 chances to score pole, 24 chances to win, plus a few sprints along the way, that feels like Norris is in a place now to kind of capitalise on any strong position he and McLaren find themselves in at the start.
And of course, it's not just Norris, is it? It's Oscar Piastri. What do you make of his chances, John? Obviously, last year, Norris was overall a step ahead, despite the fact Piastri had some very strong weekends. Do you think if McLaren is a strong title contender, if Norris is Piastri going to be a genuine rival points-wise?
I think the key for Piastri is consistency. I think on his good weekends and where he nails it from the off and things are going well, he can match Norris and, beat Norris and race for wins. And if you can race for consistent wins, you can go for the championship. I think Oscar will admit himself that it's the weekends that don't start on the right foot. He gets a bit behind, then he struggles to get things back in check, and then the weekend doesn't click. But I mean, we've got to remember he's still got a lot less experience than Lando. It's a completely new world fighting at the front in Formula One. So I think he'll have done a lot of work over the winter. I mean, I think he's mentally robust and strong, just that calmness in dealing with things. He doesn't get emotionally overwhelmed with the roller coasters of Formula One. So I think the potential is there. The key thing is if he can, is dealing with the weekends that don't start right. If he can sort that out, then there's no reason why he can't put together a championship fight.
Should we move on to Red Bull now, Scott? Obviously, the car was quick in testing, but a little bit troubled. Do you think there's a risk that for all the strengths of Max Verstappen, we know he could drag a decent lap time out of a bath on wheels, quite frankly. But do you think we could see a repeat of some of the troubles we saw last year, and therefore, without being able to bank that early lead, it's going to be very difficult for Red Bull and Verstappen? Or do you think they'll get it together and will be as tough and formidable as ever?
It's hard to say on the evidence of the way last season ended, plus the pre-season test, plus what Red Bull themselves and Verstappen himself is saying about the situation, that they'll arrive in Australia and have everything sorted. I think that they've had enough time between the test and Melbourne to iron out the worst of the uncertainties or imperfections from the test. The fact that they were still running setup experiments and aero testing evaluations until the very end of testing shows that there was a lot of data to be gathered from Red Bull's side, maybe more than any of the other top teams in terms of the way that they went about their programs. But even if they start on the back foot, if where the underlying confidence comes from actually proves to be legitimate, which is that the changes to the car are more significant than meets the eye, it will dial out the worst of the traits of last year. It will give the car that bigger operating window. You've got the sort of flexi wing allowance of the first third of the season, and then the clamp down for the next 2/3 of the season, which Red Bull privately seems to think that will suit them or hurt them less than others, is maybe a better way of putting it. All of those things come together, and then actually maybe Red Bull's on for not necessarily a repeat of the first 5 or 6 events of last year with a massive car advantage, but those sort of flashes you saw of Red Bull in the final quarter of last season, where Verstappen's just got something he can fight with on a more regular basis in qualifying, and then he has track position in the race. So even if he's on a little bit more of a rearguard action over a stint, he's doing it while having track position and the like. So Verstappen only needs a sniff of that to be fighting for podiums and wins, race in, race out. That is where I think is kind of the best case scenario for Red Bull. I mean, if they come out in Australia in the first few races and Verstappen is on pole at more events than not, and winning races, at arm's length or anything like that. That I think that one be a huge achievement given where they were at the end of last year, but it would also be a surprise. I don't think anybody is going to Melbourne, even those most optimistic within Red Bull, thinking that they should be winning that season opener. I mean, that'll be the hope, but I would imagine pragmatism will rule, and they'll know that going there, getting a good baseline for the car, not being smashed by McLaren, and comparing very well against McLaren, and hopefully being ahead of Ferrari and Mercedes, is about as good a start as Red Bull and Verstappen will hope for. If that is how they begin, that's a great foundation for their season.
It feels a little bit like it's going to go in one direction or another this season for Red Bull. It could go into quite a positive spiral or a bit of a negative spiral, and then if it's the latter, there's all sorts of speculation about Verstappen's future, etc. But I'm certainly not counting them out for Melbourne. I think Red Bull, you cannot underestimate, and we know how good Verstappen is. But John, you spoke at length to Pierre Vacher, the technical director at testing, and obviously he put a little bit of meat on the bones in terms of what they're doing, how much the car has changed and why they might have been doing some of the work they were doing. So did that convince you that we should see, after a sort of brisk but a little bit tentative pre-season, they could be sure-footed come this weekend?
I think they're right. I mean, you speak to Pierre Vacher. I mean, he's a brilliant technical director, understands modern F1 cars, but I think his personality is always that unless they win a race by 30 seconds, it's not good enough. So you've got to kind of gauge his level of enthusiasm and explanation for things against what the reality is. So although his comments in the post-event press release seemed quite negative, that hadn't been the test they wanted, the car wasn't responding to the levels that they hoped it to. But I think when you pick through it and what he's talking about, I think there is a sense of understanding of the car, that there is optimism. He talked about it does have a wider operating window now, but all they're lacking is to find this perfect balance, this key balance, which is going to be, I think, a critical aspect to the season, having a car that performs in low speed, medium speed, high speed, and all different types of tracks. You can't have the variations that we've had in the past. So the team that nails this balance, the team that can get its car operating consistently at regular tracks, is going to come out on top. And I think this is what Red Bull are chasing. But the fact they seem to have moved away from the peakiness of last year, I think is probably the most positive thing that Vacher said. Basically, I think it's an indication they have made progress, even if they appear to be a bit under the radar.
Yeah, the balance of the car was a little bit hit and miss, certainly in testing, watching from trackside. So I'm really interested to see how that looks come Friday in Australia. Obviously, Scott, the other thing with Red Bull is the change of second driver. Sergio Perez out, Liam Lawson in. We're expecting him to be the number 2 driver, obviously, but do you see signs that Lawson should be on for a big season for him, which would be being a good wingman for Verstappen and picking off a win or two, probably?
Winning will be difficult because Verstappen just doesn't leave any crumbs on the table normally. So if a Red Bull's capable of winning a Grand Prix, it's more likely than not that Verstappen will be the one winning it. I think it would be a big achievement for Lawson, because nobody's expecting 2023 level Red Bull domination this year. And we've seen from Perez's time as Verstappen's teammate that a good season for a Verstappen number 2 is 1 or 2 wins. So if Lawson's pinching a win or two in a year where Red Bull's great but not dominant, that will reflect very well on him. In terms of sort of how he slots in and whether he's, a Perez peak level teammate or Perez at his worst as a teammate, I think it's going to take several races to really get a read on that. He's a driver who I can well imagine he or Red Bull will fit into that mold that I mentioned at the top of the podcast, where depending on if it starts poorly or you remember, I think it was Pierre Gasly's debut was in Melbourne when he was at Red Bull, and he was out in Q1, I think, or stuck in Q2. I can't remember, but it was definitely a race to forget, a really tough debut for Gasly, and
having crashed twice in testing.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the kind of thing that can lead very much to still finding our feet, still need to optimize things, and it all becomes we'll get there eventually. That could conceivably be where Lawson starts, because if the car's not fully sorted, we know that he's a bit light on track time. He didn't have the most productive preseason test on that front. He had that water leak on day 2, his full day in the car, so it wasn't like he only lost a few laps. He lost quite a lot of running. I think he'll be on the back foot at the start of the year. I don't see how he can't be, really, with the way that it's gone, the scale of the task he has. It's just a matter of where that shakes out pace-wise. I would be surprised if he's within a couple attempts of Verstappen consistently. I think that has to be probably the target longer term, but he could start the year a little bit further off than that. But I don't sense any alarm bells at Red Bull. It's just a case of it might take time for him to find his actual level.
There's also an interesting quirk with Lawson's career in that he's never raced at Melbourne before. F2, he was out of Formula 2 when F2 went there, so he didn't race it in his junior career. So I mentioned this to him at the F175 launch. I said, as far as I understand, you're the only rookie who hasn't raced in Melbourne. He says, no, surely Antonelli and Hadjar and stuff haven't. I said, no, they've done Formula 2, so they know it quite well. And
he looked quite disappointed when you told him that.
Very, very disappointed. So his face dropped a little bit. So I think it's going to be a brutal start, because Melbourne's not an easy track. Really, really difficult to kind of nail it, because there's no room for error. Some very quick sections, walls very near, so can go quite wrong. And then you go from Melbourne straight into a sprint race in China. So as terms of starts of seasons go, there's not much room for getting up to having a bit of time to get up to speed.
I'm intrigued to see how he gets on. I am a bit sceptical about Lawson. I'm not sure he's the driver Red Bull needs, but I'm also not sure he's not the driver Red Bull needs. There's good quality there. He's clearly an F1 level driver. So I'm really, really interested to see how he evolves over the season. But like you both said, it's a huge challenge for him, but what an opportunity as well for his first full season. Let's move on to Ferrari now, John, because Lewis Hamilton's move there, that's been the story of 2025 so far. How serious a title threat do you think he is? And how big an obstacle is teammate Charles Leclerc?
Well, Leclerc's a huge obstacle, because I think Leclerc is one of the pre-season championship favourites based on the Ferrari car being a match for McLaren. That we don't know yet. I think potentially they may have expected a bit more from the Bahrain test. I think everyone went in there thinking this is the step. They've made everything's lined up. This is going to be a car that can match the McLaren wheel for wheel. And that Norris Thursday long run was so far ahead. We're not really sure where Ferrari are. But I think if Ferrari are at the front, I think all the indications are Lewis is in a happy place. He's got a car that he's not unhappy with like he was with the Mercedes. He feels rejuvenated and refreshed and motivated. So I can sense this if the car's good enough, I think Lewis will be up there. I think he will struggle to consistently beat Leclerc in qualifying, but races could be a bit more even. So I think a lot will depend on the tightness at the front. If Lewis is 2 tenths behind Leclerc in qualifying, it doesn't matter if that Ferrari is pretty at the sharp end, but if there's a pack of 4 cars that are separated, like at Monza last year, where hundredths of a second we're deciding grid positions, then that 2 tenths can mean an awful lot, because if Leclerc starts P2 and Lewis starts P7, then the races on Sunday get very difficult.
There's kind of 3 factors with Hamilton at Ferrari. There's the obvious one, which is how good the car is. Then there's his own adaptation and whether or not those problems that Mercedes have followed over, or if he's really at the upper end of what the car's capable of. And in that situation, it is when you're finding those final hundredths and tenths of a second. And then there's the Leclerc factor, because you would imagine that if a Ferrari is good enough to fight for poles, win races, and fight for the championship, there's no evidence to suggest that Leclerc won't be doing that, because he was at a fantastic level last season. So it's not that there's a huge question mark over Hamilton's capacity or his candidacy or anything like that. It's just there are a lot of things, and it's an extreme version of the usual situation these drivers find themselves in. There's a lot of things that need to align for a driver to fight for a championship. And Hamilton, by virtue of moving from Mercedes to Ferrari, has injected some other fairly extreme variables into that equation. So from an individual driver perspective, amongst the top teams and their ambitions for the year, there's probably not another driver for whom Melbourne will offer bigger clues for than Hamilton. Everybody else will be shaking out to some degree or another, but there's a lot that Melbourne will start to answer as far as Hamilton and Ferrari are concerned.
In such an interesting position, Ferrari, because I feel like if the car's quick enough or gets to the point where it's quick enough, then they've got a really strong two driver lineup, even if Hamilton's qualifying struggles continue, I don't think there's any guarantee that would be the case. He's still formidable in races, and we know that team's sharpened up loads over the past few years. So I think it's really a fascinating question that the Ferrari, I think they're going to be up there, but I would say testing was just putting a slight dampener on the whole thing. But they've got the strong two driver lineup, and I guess with these teams we've talked about, that's the really interesting dynamic, isn't it? Because you've got two strong drivers in Ferrari, you'd say the same in McLaren, and there's that question mark over Lawson at Red Bull. And let's say you have those three teams all at a similar level over the year. That actually, if Lawson doesn't manage to hit the ground running and really excel, that could be a weak point. And I don't know about you, Scott, but I always think that it's not just the Constructors' Championship, it's the Drivers' Championship as well. You need a strong second driver to take points off your rival on your good weekends. Otherwise, on your good weekends, you win and your teammate's fourth and your title rival second, whereas on their good weekends, they might win with their teammate in second. So it's an interesting dynamic to the equation.
Yeah, and I think if you had a hypothetical scenario where all four top teams produced over the course of the season equally competitive cars, my money would be on Ferrari to win the Constructors' Championship, as long as that adaptation for Hamilton is as smooth or as effective, rather, because it's never going to be smooth with how much he's learning in a short space of time, but as effective as he thinks it is going to be based on the trajectory he's seen so far. I don't see why those two drivers won't be up there scoring points, backing each other up constantly. Hamilton and Leclerc feels like a relationship as teammates that at its peak should be the very definition of when one's just off on a weekend, the other's right there to pick up the slack. Whereas, there's a little bit more, there's an obvious gap with Verstappen and Lawson. Even at McLaren, we saw last season a few too many weekends from Oscar Piastri where, as John mentioned, it started poorly, he's a little bit off it, and he's just not quite there at times in the way that Norris is. And then at Mercedes as well, you have the wild card in a rookie in Kimi Antonelli. So George Russell will be there more often than not. But it'll be a volatile season for Antonelli. His season will be full of oscillations in terms of performance. So that's where I think the big opportunity lies for Ferrari, as long as there's a car capable of doing it.
I think there's all the issue with teams having a clear number one, even if it's not designated, but one guy has taken all the points, is it means you're not losing points to your teammate. Because this could be a season where the Constructors' Championship and Drivers' Championship go two completely separate ways. If Max is hauling all the points, best points for Red Bull, and say Leclerc and Hamilton are, knocking each other and taking points off each other, could be a fascinating dynamic in how that all shakes out. Same as McLaren, same at Mercedes. That how those things shake out. The driver that's grabbing 100% of the best points in a team could be in a pretty good spot.
Yeah, that's the thing that's difficult to work out until it's happened, isn't it? Because it can go either way. Either you need the strong teammate taking points off the others, or you need them not taking points off you, and it's kind of threading the needle to get that right. I personally tend towards having two strong drivers, because I think that puts you in a good position, but it can also cause you problems. Plenty of famous examples of that. Shall we talk about the Race Members Club? Because we've been doing a lot more of that this year. Very much enjoying that. We've got a 90% off your first month special pre-season offer on at the moment. So if you want to have a very low-cost, low-risk trial, that's where you need to go. Scott, what have we got planned for Australia?
It's a good question. We should work it out.
We'll treat this as the planning meeting.
No, it'll be hopefully more of what we offered from testing, in terms of these slightly more informal, bite-sized bits of analysis and debriefing as we pick stuff up. Testing, there was a heavy emphasis on doing it trackside, but we also tried to do some ad hoc sort of, not quite podcasting, but podcasting effectively, a couple of other sort of video debriefs as well. And I think the first round of the season, which we've sort of not jokingly, but like quite warmly referred to in the past as like the first proper day of that F1 season, and that's what it will be like this year. So the first day back in the paddock, speaking to people at a Grand Prix event, the first time we see them out in Friday practice, and we get the first hint of qualifying simulations on Friday afternoon. And then, of course, all the fuel comes out, the softest tyres go on, and there is no hiding place come qualifying. And then obviously the Grand Prix itself. So there'll be loads of opportunities through the weekend. And I'm quite intrigued to see exactly what we come up with. The beauty of it is that like the thing that is sort of like the most organised is the desire and capacity to do this stuff. And then there's just a really fun, slightly spur of the moment creativity element to it, which is where opportunities arise to do it, we'll jump on those opportunities. And that will be the cadence of that, the rhythm of it will be determined by what we learned and when we learned and how we learn it. So it'll be fun. It'll be a learning experience for us as well as the people that are hopefully learning something from whatever it is we come up with.
Absolutely, and that's always the aim, just to be informative and maybe even entertaining at times as well. That's the that's the target. But I'll certainly be doing on probably the Monday after the race. I will go through on Patreon the comments about my driver rankings and talk through them. I tend to do that without any prep and blind, so people can say, why have you done this, and offer their opinions, and I'll just respond to that. So that's one of the things I know I'll be doing, but we'll all be doing plenty when we're down under. So yeah, like I say, there's a 90% off your first month special pre-season offer. Click the link in the episode description to find out more, or if you head to Patreon and search for the race, you'll find out everything you need to know there. And you get loads of other things like ad-free podcasts, question asking privileges for this podcast, early access articles and videos, loads and loads of stuff there for you to enjoy. Okay, let's move on to what I'm going to call the wild card in the top four pack, Scott, which is Mercedes. So given testing went pretty well, could this be George Russell's moment?
If the car is really as good in most conditions, because I can't imagine it will be in all conditions, that's just not how it's worked in F1 the last few years, then this could be a massive year for Mercedes and George Russell, because in the cooler conditions in Bahrain, that car really came alive. It regularly looked sort of the most compliant on track. The drivers were very happy with the balance. Mercedes themselves, not getting too carried away, but admitted it had been a very positive test. It's just a case of whether this was a little bit of an illusion born from the fact that Mercedes historically has been good in cooler conditions. We saw it last year. Look at how Russell dominated the Las Vegas weekend. But it's an unknown. So if you give them the benefit of the doubt and you say, well, this car was, or this team was dominant before, maybe they have finally cracked the ground effect era, and this will be sort of where the peak is again, but a more accessible peak. Then you look at Las Vegas and you say, that's what Russell can do. And therein lies a hugely exciting opportunity for him. And the slightly more cynical view, which is a bit less generous, is that this was entirely flattered by conditions in Bahrain. We don't trust Mercedes after false dawns over the last 2 or 3 years. You need a few races in warmer conditions, and Melbourne may well provide that, although it has been a little bit sort of unpredictable weather-wise at times over the years. We'll start to get some answers. That feels to me like Mercedes, you called them a wild card, has the sort of biggest gap between potential floor and potential ceiling in terms of performance.
And the really interesting thing is that if they can be consistent, and I'm still sceptical on that because of what we've seen over the past 3 years, I think Russell, who had a really strong season last year, is definitely going to be capable of fighting for a championship. We saw he set that line in the sand with Verstappen, saying, well, some drivers let him bully them, and it was very, very calculated. We've talked about that before from Russell, so I like that from him. But he's also, John, got the other problem, which is Kimi Antonelli. Now, you might think an 18-year-old rookie shouldn't really be an issue, but there haven't been many rookies who've come into F1 quite as highly regarded as Antonelli, and certainly the team thinks he's their Verstappen or their Lewis Hamilton from 2007 at McLaren.
Yeah, I think Antonelli's going to be fast. Absolute zero doubt about that. But I think the season, especially the early phase, may be similar to what we saw from Antonelli in Monza last year. That blindingly fast, really impressive, grabbed everyone's attention just by how he was, blistering out the pits, but a bit too fast, a bit too enthusiastic, and ended in the barriers. So I think it's going to be a season of incredible peaks and a few troughs for Kimi. But I think there will be times where, George is left scratching his head and maybe having to, work out why he is behind. But I think consistently in terms of race pace, understanding tyres, understanding what's needed to be successful in Formula 1, I think George will come out on top. Because it's still amazing that Antonelli run on the Thursday in Bahrain, which has given us the clearest definition of the top three teams. That was his first ever proper race sim on current race tyres, because everything had been done on the Academy tyres they use for TPC. So he's got a steep learning curve to go through, but I think there's going to be some spectacular moments, and I can't wait to see what Kimi does.
I feel like he'll benefit from getting a big result early on just to settle everything, because you can see a scenario, particularly with being primed by what happened at Monza. If he has a few bad weekends early on, which a rookie can have. Remember Charles Leclerc, when he started, had 3 iffy weekends at the start of his Sauber season before everything clicked. I think that's when the pressure will pile on, and that'll be a bit of a test of him mentally, which I think is probably the biggest question mark, because there's phenomenal ability there, and I suspect he's going to have a good season. But that's the one concern if the pressure piles up on him early in the year. But I'd be surprised if the Mercedes can win races at least sporadically. I'd be surprised if Antonelli doesn't get a win on the board this year. I think he's absolutely capable of doing that. But I guess, Scott, Mercedes is the team that we need the most help from to have the dream season, isn't it? Because we're hoping for 4 teams to be genuine title threats. I think there's a good chance of 3 of them being. Mercedes is the one that needs to do us that favour, isn't it?
Yeah, probably. But like I said before, there's I think it has the biggest gap between sort of how good it can be and maybe how disappointing it can be. But there are question marks over Ferrari and Red Bull based off of preseason testing and whether they've achieved exactly what they needed to achieve. And even within McLaren, there's a little bit of risk in terms of some of the choices that they've made on the 25 cars. What will that actually be like in reality as you go to different tracks, different conditions? So maybe Mercedes is the one that needs to do a little bit more to convince us that that's where it'll be at its best. But it could be that it's not a case of if Mercedes gets it right, that's it. We have 4 teams in the mix, because there are a few doubts over pretty. I would say all four teams, and it's just we're at a point now in F1 where it's got so competitive. The best team will be the team that ends up with the sort of fewest doubts when it matters.
Yeah, and with the expectation it's going to be so close, it is going to be that consistency, not just in terms of car pace and car versatility, but execution, and that's going to be so critical this year. But I think it would be a surprise if all 4 of those teams don't win races, and we could even get all 8 of those drivers winning races this year. That wouldn't surprise me at all. Let's get into the midfield pack now, John. Alpine looked very good in testing. So did Williams. Who's your money on for Australia for that midfield pack, which we're still expecting to be a little bit set back from the top 4?
Yeah, it's intriguing, those 2 teams, because I think they were nip and tuck in the Bahrain test, but few levels were playing a quite big difference, because I think Williams were running lighter, being a bit more aggressive in that test than Alpine. So we've not seen both. But there is quite an interesting dynamic there, because Williams, if they are evenly matched, Williams has got a super strong driver lineup. Albon and Carlos Sainz, are going to bring points. They're going to bring good results. They're going to bring consistency. They're going to push each other on. They're going to maximise that development. Whereas Alpine, it's got Gasly, who's strong, but I think Jack Doohan's coming from a little bit further behind. He's going to take time to get up to full speed. He's got the pressure of Colapinto hanging around there in the background. That's, no matter what he says, he's going to be thinking about it, and he's going to be asked about it, and it's going to be hanging there. So I think Williams has the potential to score more, but Alpine may be able to pull off the odd better result. So what about Gasly finishes ahead of them in the race, but Williams score more points overall?
Absolutely possible. That's in line with the prediction I made pre-season when I was asked about the midfield, and I think I had Gasly as the top driver and Williams as the top team. Very, very possible. And Gasly, you're right. I've always thought Gasly was quick, but I've had concerns about the narrowness of his window. But he's one of those drivers who just keeps chipping away at things, just gradually making himself better, which I like to see. And I think he's got a slightly wider window now as well. But Scott, it's hard to see that Doohan question not becoming a thing. I feel like, and this is asking a lot, he really needs to go to the first few races and be putting in Q3 performances and picking up points. I don't think he's got time to play his way in, because it is going to be the Franco Colapinto pressure ramping up. It's Alpine that's created that. Williams have said that one of the reasons he's moved is there's a chance of a race seat this year. This isn't some media concoction. That's a very, very serious threat. And Doohan's first thing is to just get in the car, use his incumbency to excel. No matter how, you can't just say, "Oh, I need to see my way in," because if you don't do it in the first half dozen races, you might not get a race 7 through 24 of the season.
Yeah, exactly. They look. All Alpine says, unsurprisingly, is that they're starting the season with Gasly and Doohan, and then they'll see what happens. So it's not like Ollie Oakes and co are exactly pretending that Doohan is absolutely locked in. So you're right; he doesn't have time. He probably deserves a bit more time than he'll get if things aren't going great. I can see them moving in the first half of the year. There's obviously been a lot of attention over whether it's 5 races at the start of the year or whatever. I think exactly how long Doohan has depends on how he performs. It feels like he could end up being the most extreme manifestation of you're only as good as your last race that we've seen since probably Daniel Kvyat at Red Bull, when he obviously got dropped for Max Verstappen early in the 2016 season. If you remember, it didn't matter that Kvyat wasn't far off, hadn't long since scored a podium, that he was being dumped because the next big thing had come along. And that's not to compare Colapinto with Verstappen, as much as there are some people who would like to probably believe that comparison is legitimate. But it's more that Alpine are almost doing a slightly more open and obvious version of the brutality that exists within F1 teams when it comes to making driver choices. And Red Bull's always been the kind of benchmark in that regard. But that's where Alpine's got to now. It's just trying to put itself in a position, having got a little bit lost on drivers, missed out on its number one target, and they made no secret of the fact that they were chasing Carlos Sainz last year. Doohan kind of ended up in the position of taking the drive for 25, partly because of incumbency, in that he was the team's reserve driver. He was the leading junior driver around at the time. Now he has to use that to his advantage, because while there are certain elements of the way this has been handled and the way it's been talked about that I disagree with, one thing I do agree with is with Oakes is what he said, that while this has been Doohan's dream, it's also a job. He has to come in and perform at a high level. And that doesn't mean, it's all right if he's a couple attempts off Gasly and nearly scoring points in the first few races. If that car's in Q3, if that car's scoring points, Doohan has to be in Q3 and scoring points. It's not going to be enough to just be doing an all right job compared to Gasly.
Yeah, absolutely. If he does that, he will be able to hang on to the drive. I don't believe the team's going to hobble him or anything or deliberately do it, because if they didn't want him in the car, they'll just take him out the first opportunity anyway. And all they're doing by doing that is costing themselves points. So I think the machinery will give him the chance, but yeah, he's got some pretty lofty objectives. Doohan's the kind of character, though, who will know this, and he will, I think, go into those races knowing he needs to deliver. And I think he'll go quite attacking as well and trying to really push himself to get the best out of himself. That's all he can do. And if he does that, then that could very well change the direction of his Formula One career, which I think would be great to see, because he's a quick driver. He's worked very, very hard to get that seat. Let's run through some of the other teams now. Haas, Scott, obviously we didn't see much of them in testing other than sort of rolling around doing race runs on fairly heavy fuel. They look pretty good for the midfield, don't they? We know they've got a strong driver lineup. So Haas just looks like your quality midfield operation, doesn't it?
Well, we did. You're right. We did actually see quite a lot of Haas. We just didn't know what we were seeing, and it wasn't particularly illuminating, because what we did see of them was in a very specific program, and we didn't see a huge amount of what they're actually capable of. So I was thinking this actually when you were asking the Alpine Williams question at the start of like the midfielders, that I know all the attention's at the front, and it should be, and it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see exactly where that shakes out. The midfield is almost inevitably now like the area where we have the potential to have been most quote unquote wrong after pre-season testing. We called it as we saw it. We weren't making a grand prediction for the year, but it's the part where Haas is a good example. We think that it, as you say, it looks like a very well managed, strong, efficient, professional midfield outfit based on what it's done at testing. But if actually all it's doing is rolling around really consistent, doing a load of long run work, but it's actually 3 temps off, then that comes crashing down. And then the way that you sort of built the picture around that changes. So Haas has the potential to be almost like the sort of center point from which the order of the midfield is actually established. We're expecting Alpine and Williams to be ahead, and we're expecting sort of Racing Bulls to be around it, and expecting Aston Martin and Sauber to probably be a bit behind Haas to start with, but we don't know. And maybe we won't know after Melbourne, because this has traditionally been a very happy hunting ground for Haas. So who knows? Maybe they're maybe Haas right now, as we see it, is kind of the dark horse to be best of the rest in Australia, even if that's not a position that it could then sustain through the year.
Well, they're kind of the Mercedes of the midfield, aren't they? They're the wild card. But they might be able to sustain it through the year if they do deliver that, because they developed well last season. In fact, they were the 5th quickest car in the final part of last season after that Austin upgrade. So, yeah, Haas are interesting, because if you compare them to, say, Racing Bulls, who are very much kind of midfield of the midfield, I think we're pretty sure, based on Bahrain, that Racing Bulls are a 10th, 2/10, 3/10 off the front of the midfield pace. That's probably the window, depending on the fuel loads. Whereas we're not 100% certain on Haas. Haas could be further up, could be a little bit further down. But Racing Bulls are an interesting one, aren't they, John? Because they are a B team ultimately. They are the junior team for Red Bull, no matter what the rhetoric is. So they are, by definition, a midfield Formula One team. They sort of made decent progress through testing. Obviously, in Tsunoda, they've got a driver now who, A, has got something to prove because his future's up in the air, but who's also now a very experienced campaigner and really is kind of at one with himself, I think, in terms of what he can do. So that makes Racing Bulls quite an interesting proposition for this year, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think they're not pretending that they're at the head of that midfield pack. I sat down with Laura Meckes after the test. He says feel they're a little bit behind, but we're talking, the 2 to 3 temps that probably over the course of the season is going to be defining which of those midfield teams gets through to Q3 and who gets dumped out in Q1. And it's probably going to fluctuate around, and it'll be the team that's more consistently at the front end of that than the back end that's going to come out on top in terms of the Constructors' Championship. But Racing Bulls is, it's going under a bit of a kind of repackaging, so to speak. It's sorted its identity out. It's now moved into its factory complex on the Milton Keynes Red Bull campus. It's pulling things together. These things take time. They don't happen overnight. So there is progress there. And Meckes was interesting on Tsunoda. I mentioned about, how he'd come back after the winter. Meckes said he was disappointed, very disappointed he didn't get the Red Bull seat, but he's been impressed. He says it's kind of, he's at peace with himself. He's lit a switch. He's focused. He's determined. His feedback's taken a step up. He's embraced this leadership position, and the team's given him the assurance that they're ready to build a package around him, build a team around him, and make him a better driver that other big teams cannot ignore. So I think Yuki's sensed the opportunity that's there. He's got to do this himself now. He's not going to get the Red Bull seat. Honda are going to Aston Martin. They've talked about him doing his own thing now. So Yuki knows it's in his hands. He needs to step up. He needs to push that team. And he may be helped by being the team leader at Racing Bulls, because Hadjar is coming in with minimal experience. He's probably got the least amount of F1 mileage of anybody coming into the year. It's going to take time for him to step up. So this is the chance for Yuki to really show us what he can do.
Hadjar feels like one who could go either way to me, Scott. I think there's real ability there, but there's also real question marks. And I'm not sure Red Bull were that keen on putting him into F1. He ended up taking that seat, I think, because he was the next cab off the rank and really the only realistic option. So he's someone with a lot to prove, but who could perhaps bring a surprise, particularly as the season goes on.
He's a driver with a very high ceiling, I think, in terms of performance. There's a lot of raw ability there. It's just how well harnessed it is, how calm he can stay. Not to perpetrate too many stereotypes, but obviously the kind of emotional control, mental control has been a big talking point with Tsunoda. Self-described issues on that front in terms of losing control, getting a bit too angry and a bit too raw in the car. And he's worked really hard to kind of control that as best he can, because no driver is ever fully in control of their emotions when stuff annoys them and or upsets them. And the team has talked quite a lot about how much Tsunoda has evolved in that regard. But it's been, a 5-year process for Tsunoda, sort of gradually getting on top of that and mitigating the weaknesses that come with it as much as possible. And Hadjar's only at the start of that journey. He's another driver who's had radio outbursts in Formula 2. He's another driver who people at Red Bull have talked about that kind of composure and how much of a question mark that is. But while F1's not exactly a finishing school, you don't arrive at F1 as a certain driver and person and then stay that same driver and person for then the rest of your career. You refine it, you learn, and you get tested in a way. Hadjar's going to get stress tested in a mental sense, an emotional sense, a physical sense, in a way that he hasn't before. in Formula 2. So it'll be a very steep learning curve. All of the stuff that comes with mileage, and as John mentioned, he's very low on that, is Hadjar in an F1 context. First proper running in Formula 1 came in an FP1 out in Mexico for the second team. And then he had 2 with Red Bull last year that were very different in terms of the way Red Bull went about running him and putting pressure on him effectively. So he's going to be picking stuff up from a driving perspective, from a mental capacity perspective, from a perspective of emotional control, all the way through this year and beyond. Tsunoda's a great example of that. It's just sort of where he falls in. It's a little bit like I was saying about Antonelli earlier. Like the oscillations through the season for Hadjar could be massive. There could be times, if that car's capable of it, where he scores really, really good points finishes and maybe even a run of points finishes. But there might also be times where he gets flustered, where he doesn't maximise it and he's out in Q1 when the car's capable of a lot more, where he's sort of getting defensive or lashing out or anything like that. And it's going to be part of the journey that he goes on this year to kind of get on top of that and not necessarily just decide what kind of driver he's going to be, but show what kind of driver he can be in Formula 1.
Aston Martin were probably the disappointment of the test, John. We know what we'll get from Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll, but is this going to be a tough season for them?
I think so. We haven't seen any indications or promise that they've made a massive step. They're at the front of the midfield, that it's going to be anywhere near the repeat of how 2023 started. So it is going to be a challenge. But it's just going to take time to sort themselves out. I mean, Adrian Newey has now started work at Aston Martin, so there will be a bit more input in terms of any outlined concepts. Even if he's not working full on the 25 car, his kind of feedback, and he will be there for some guidance. Obviously, the Enrico Cardier situation isn't ideal for them. They've got to wait till July. So that's put a kind of spanner in their long-term works on that front. I can see them potentially being the team that bails first in terms of developing this car and switching to 26, that potentially feels is that there isn't the scope to make the massive improvement. It's not a year where you make a B-spec car and change things for the second half. So I think it will be fascinating to see exactly where they shake out. Because I think if they do start the season in 9th place, there's going to be some glum faces down at the garage, and Fernando Alonso's response will be fascinating.
They might have a rival in terms of needing to switch focus to next year and glum faces in Sauber, though, Scott, with Nico Hülkenberg and rookie Gabriel Bortoleto. We've not had a good word to say about them in pre-season. Nobody really has had a good word to say about them. They look resoundingly lost. Can you find any reasons to be cheerful?
It's the last season of seeing that livery and colour scheme, which will be good. Then the rebrand for Audi should be quite fun. No, I think the playing Sauber's advocate, there was a point last year where, yes, they were obviously hopelessly pointless, literally, as the season went on, and it looked irredeemable. But as senior people inside the team were obviously at pains to point out, it's not like they were disastrously adrift or anything like that performance-wise. It's just the pecking order is condensed to a probably unprecedented level in F1, and they were being punished by, worst is relative, right? They're the least good of the 10 teams. There's no chaos team this year. It doesn't look like Sauber's so bad that there's, the 25 cars a total shed or anything like that. So you look at it and think, well, they made progress. They got back to where they were at the start of 2024 by the end of it. They did grab a points finish, and they were back sort of midfield respectability a bit by the end of the season. If that trajectory can continue, if they can lean on the experience that Nico Hülkenberg has, if they can cultivate the talent that is Gabriel Bortoleto, who does look like a very interesting driver to watch, and I just have the sense it's a little bit more together than Hadjar is, then there's potential for this to be a really valuable learning year for Sauber. Because this isn't a case that you get to the end of the Sauber, the kick stake era, and then you flick a switch, it becomes Audi and everything's better next year. There's not a lot that carries over car-wise, development-wise, but in terms of tools, in terms of understanding, in terms of people, in terms of the way that they just work as a team, you can't write this year off. They're playing catch-up because they've missed they've missed a trick in terms of managing the ramp-up they had for the Audi era in 26 badly. And then that's the result of infighting and decisions made by maybe some people that are still there, but certainly some people that aren't there anymore. So how much Sauber evolves this year could be a silver lining. If they start the season last, which it looks very realistic that they might be, but they end the season fighting for points fairly consistently, then maybe they're in an Aston Martin situation, a la 2022-23, where the championship position says one thing, but reality says another. That has to be Sauber's target this year.
Right, we've covered the off-track stuff, but F1 is a war waged in the paddock, on multiple fronts, and in the world of politics.
In newsletters.
Exactly. Newsletters, which is a new one. But yeah, we talked about that briefly the other day. But Scott, what's top of your agenda in terms of what you're going to be chasing in the coming year?
Very good question. Well, just the never-ending story of that kind of like political battle between the Mohammed Ben Sulayem, the FA president, and seemingly everybody else, like foes on all sides, is significant because I do think we've reached a tipping point now for it's no longer just noise that happens a lot around the periphery of F1. It's stuff that has a tangible impact on the way F1 is. And obviously he may well be re-elected this year. At the moment, it doesn't seem like there's anyone standing against him. So then it's another many years of the same thing, unless there can be some kind of resolution. But it just all feels like it's going in one direction. So you have that specifically on the political side. There's wrangling potentially going to emerge on the 2026 rules because some stuff still isn't set. There'll be some teams that get wind potentially of others developing something that they thought was absolutely off limits. There'll be discussions that kind of evolve there. So that's also fascinating. And then obviously the gift that kept giving last year was the driver market. And that is a bit dormant at the moment, but will burst into life at some point because we know that George Russell is a key player there in terms of will he continue at Mercedes? Will Mercedes launch a fresh move for Max Verstappen to get him out of Red Bull? Are some of the drivers that got ousted, like Sergio Perez or Valtteri Bottas, going to get back on the grid? Because there's a whole other team to consider for 2026. So 2 seats to fill at Cadillac. That I'm sure, I don't think it'll necessarily be quite as drawn out, convoluted and magnificent as last year's driver market saga was, but it will fire back into life at some point.
How about you, John? Is there anything a little bit more left field you're thinking may crop up later this year, or is it just the knowledge that something will, and it'll probably come as a surprise?
No, I think there will be some key issues. I think Scott's right about Mohammed Ben Sulayem. I think that's going to be a major talking point over the start of this season. There isn't a candidate yet, but kind of speaking to people who know what's going on behind the scenes.
There are noises.
There are noises that something is kind of. Someone messaged me last night and just said, "Watch this space," basically. So I think there are things going on, and that could become a big talking point, especially as we head into Concord Agreement negotiations, because that needs to be signed off this year. I don't think we're in a situation we've had in the past where Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley were splitting teams and playing teams off each other, and there was a big war between the teams and the commercial rights holding the FIA. I think everything's much more together. But I think the FIA's situation, this is fascinating because the FIA wants more money off FOM. This has been something that Ben Sulayem has pushed on a lot about getting the FIA's books in a better shape, getting more income, securing its future. So this could become a big issue against the backdrop of that remarkable letter from David Richards we had this week criticising the leadership. So I think that plays out would be interesting. I think flexi wings again are going to be a massive talking point. We've had the first inklings of mini DRS complaints. The FIA is now going to be monitoring rear wings in Melbourne. So we've got mini DRS. We've also saw the Mercedes wing was flexing back a bit. So there's a lot of tricks going on. Then at the front as well, we've had the battle over the winter between those teams wanting this clampdown to come in for Melbourne, the pushback from McLaren and Ferrari to get it delayed, which has ended up at Spain. So, teams frustrated. They've got to spend money on development in the interim period. Then how's it going to change it? If it pulls things back towards Red Bull, is this going to be the defining moment of the championship if things are close and suddenly they're not from Spain? So I think there's going to be a lot of fascination, and because teams aren't going to want to spend money developing long into the season, they want to shut things off as quickly as they can. So if they see their rivals doing something clever, the option this time around isn't to do it yourself. The option now is to get that stopped and stamp it out. So I think there's going to be these two battlegrounds are going to play out quite intriguingly over the first 1/3 of the season.
Absolutely. Well, we're expecting and hoping it to be close on track, but we know there's going to be all sorts going on off track because there always is. F1 as a whole can't help itself, can it? So lots to look forward to there. Well, thanks very much, Scott and John. We're going to pack our bags and head off towards Melbourne now for the Australian Grand Prix. So stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.